Just after midnight on the 26th of September, 1983, a computer in a bunker south of Moscow decided that the United States had begun the Third World War. The bunker was called Serpukhov 15. It was the ground station for a new network of Soviet early warning satellites, codenamed OKO, the Eye, and its job was to watch the American missile fields and report the instant anything left the ground. The duty officer that night was a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. He was not even meant to be there. He had swapped onto the shift. At around 15 minutes past midnight, the panel in front of him lit up with a single word, in letters built to be impossible to ignore. Launch. One American intercontinental missile climbing out of Montana aimed at the Soviet Union. The system rated its own confidence at the highest level it had. Petrov had at most a few minutes. His only task was to lift the telephone and pass the warning up the chain where other men would decide whether to fire back before the warheads landed. He hesitated, and while he hesitated, the screen changed. 2 missiles, then 3, then 4, then 5. Everything about the display said this was real. Everything Petrov knew about the world said it could not be. Why would America open a nuclear war with 5 missiles when it had thousands? So he lifted the phone, and he told his superiors it was a false alarm before he had any way of knowing that it was. He was right. There were no missiles, but hold on to that phrase, false alarm, because the question this film is going to answer is not how one man kept his nerve. It is this: how many times has the machine been wrong, and what exactly has been standing between its mistakes and the end of the world? Let me be plain about the method before we go on, because this film makes a claim, and it is not the claim you are expecting. The popular story of the Cold War is a story about men with their fingers on a button, about whether Khrushchev or Andropov, one president or another, was reckless enough to start a war, or wise enough to stop one. That story treats the danger as a question of intent. I am going to argue that intent was almost never the problem. Go through the near misses one at a time. The moments we now know brought the world to the edge, and the same shape appears again and again. Not a leader choosing to attack. A machine or a man reading a machine reporting an attack that was not happening. A rising moon read as a wave of missiles. A training tape mistaken for the real thing. A faulty chip that cost 46 cents. Sunlight on the tops of clouds. If that is true, then the risk of nuclear war is not really measured by how aggressive the two sides were. It is measured by something colder, and something you can actually count. How often the warning systems cried wolf, and how much stood in the way when they did. That number is the instrument. The rest of this film is an attempt to read it. To count the false alarms, you first have to understand the machine that produces them, because the machine is the whole problem. By the 1960s, both superpowers had built themselves the same trap. Each had missiles that could cross the world in around 30 minutes. Each knew the other could destroy its cities in a single strike. And each drew the same brutal conclusion. If the enemy's missiles are already in the air, you cannot wait for them to land before you decide. You have to be ready to fire back while the attack is still on the way. Launch on warning, the doctrine was called. It meant that the decision to end the world was placed on a timer of minutes, and handed, in the first instance, not to a statesman, but to a censor. This is the part people miss. The bomb did not create the danger. The clock did. Once you promise to answer an attack before it arrives, you are no longer defended by human judgment working at human speed. You are defended by how quickly a warning can be checked, and by whether the thing raising the alarm is telling the truth. And the things raising the alarm were radar sets, satellites, and computers built by people, running on components, reading a noisy and ambiguous world. They did not have to be sabotaged to fail. They only had to do what all complex machines do. They had to make mistakes. There is a historian whose work sits underneath everything I am about to show you, and I want to name him now, because the argument is his before it is mine. His name is Scott Sagan, and in 1993 he published a book called The Limits of Safety. Sagan studied the systems we build to handle our most dangerous technologies, and he reached a conclusion that is genuinely uncomfortable. In a sufficiently complex, tightly coupled system, accidents are not a sign that something has gone wrong. They are a normal feature of how the system runs. Add more safety devices, more redundancy, more warnings, and you do not simply get more safety. You also get more components that can fail, more alarms that can misfire, and more ways for the parts to interact that nobody predicted. Safety, he argued, has limits that are built into complexity itself. Apply that to nuclear command and control, the vast machine of radars and satellites and telephones and men, and you get a prediction. Not that a war will be chosen, that the system will, sooner or later, generate false signals of attack, not once, repeatedly, as a matter of routine. So here is the test. If Sagan is right, the historical record should be littered with false alarms. Machines reporting a war that was not happening. Let us go and count them, and let us watch, each time, what actually stopped the count from becoming the end. Before we start counting, one more distinction, because it decides how you read every case that follows. A false positive can happen in two different places. The first is at the sensor, the radar, the satellite, the chip. The machine looks at the world and reports something that is simply not there. A rising moon becomes a missile salvo. Sunlight becomes a rocket plume. This is the false positive in its purest form, a failure of the instrument. The second happens one level up in the human being reading the instrument. Here the sensor may be working perfectly. It reports exactly what it sees. But what it sees is ambiguous, and a frightened, exhausted person primed to expect the worst reads an attack into a signal that was never an attack. The machine did not lie. The mind supplied the war. Keep those two apart, sensor error and interpretation error, because lazy retelling smear them together into a single fog of near misses. They are not the same thing, and the difference matters. One tells you your instruments can betray you. The other tells you that even perfect instruments are only as safe as the state of mind of the person holding them. Both are false positives. Both nearly ended us. And over the next half hour, we are going to meet both, more times than you will be comfortable with. Start under the sea in October 1962, because it is the earliest case where the false positive was not a broken machine but a misread signal, and because it is the closest, by most accounts, that we have ever come. The Cuban Missile Crisis you half remember. The United States discovers Soviet nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida, and President Kennedy throws a naval blockade around the island. What almost nobody was told at the time is what that blockade was doing to the men underneath it. Beneath the Atlantic were 4 Soviet submarines, diesel boats, sent to escort the missile shipments. They were old, they were slow, and crucially, to run they had to surface regularly to take in air and recharge their batteries. Down there in the heat and the dark, cut off, their air foul, their batteries dying, the crews had almost no idea what was happening in the world above. They had lost radio contact with Moscow. For all they knew, the war they had been sent to fight had already begun. And one of those submarines, B-59, was carrying something the Americans hunting it did not know about. A single torpedo, tipped with a nuclear warhead, roughly as powerful as the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The American task force found B-59 and did exactly what its rules told it to do. To force the submarine to the surface, the destroyers began dropping practice depth charges, small signaling explosives, the naval equivalent of knocking hard on a door. In American doctrine, this was a message: come up, identify yourself. It was not meant to sink anyone. But put yourself inside the hull. You have had no contact with Moscow for days. Your air is running out. Your instruments are failing in the heat. And now explosions are going off against the outside of your boat, one after another, ringing the metal like a bell. You cannot see that they are harmless. You have no way to know that the men above are only knocking. From inside B-59, this was not a signal. This was an attack. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, reached the only conclusion the evidence in front of him supported. The war had started, and he had a nuclear torpedo. According to the accounts that reached us, he gave the order to prepare it to fire. The men who had been sent to the bottom of the sea were about to answer a knock on the door with a nuclear weapon, because they had read a signal as the opening of a war. What stopped it was a quirk of paperwork and a single man. Launching that torpedo required the agreement of the senior officers aboard. On most of the submarines, 2 men had to concur. But B-59 happened to be carrying the commander of the entire submarine flotilla, an officer named Vasily Arkhipov. His presence meant that on this boat, 3 men had to agree, and Arkhipov refused. He argued them down in the sweltering dark, insisting they surface and re-establish contact rather than fire. They did. B-59 came up, met the Americans, and eventually turned for home. No torpedo, no war. And that is the version that has made Arkhipov famous. The man who said no, the man who single-handedly saved the world. Now here is where I have to be honest with you, because this film does not deal in tidy heroes. Russian materials declassified in 2022 complicate that clean story. Some historians now question whether Arkhipov's veto was quite as solitary and decisive as the legend has it. The accounts do not fully agree, and much of the drama has been polished by retelling. But notice what does not wobble. The nuclear torpedo was real and it was aboard. The crew had lost contact. The signaling charges were real and were read as an attack. The minutes were real. Whether or not one man's refusal was the hinge, the structure of the danger is untouched. A false reading of an ambiguous signal took a submarine crew to the edge of launching a nuclear weapon. The mechanic does not need the hero to be true. Come up from the sea and forward in time, and the false positives start coming from the machines themselves. Go back first to the 5th of October, 1960, to the very beginning of the age of automated warning. The Americans had just switched on a new radar system in Thule, in Greenland, part of a chain built to spot Soviet missiles coming over the pole. It was one of the first machines ever tasked with watching for the end of the world, and within its first months of operation, it reported one. The screens at North American Aerospace Defense Command lit up with a massive Soviet missile launch. Dozens of objects, the system said, rising and heading for North America. The alarm was graded near the top of the scale. In the command center, the tension was immediate and real. The cause, when they worked it out, would set the pattern for everything that followed. The radar was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. It had detected something enormous rising predictably over the horizon, exactly where a Soviet strike might come from. It had detected the moon. The most powerful early warning radar yet built had mistaken the rising of the moon for a nuclear war. The first entry in our count. And already the machine had reported an apocalypse that was 250,000 miles away. Now to the 9th of November, 1979, and to a false alarm so clean, so total, that it reads like a nightmare about the machine age. Deep inside the American warning system, the computers that watched for a Soviet attack suddenly showed one. Not a handful of missiles, a full-scale, all-out Soviet first strike. The displays filled with the numbers everyone had trained for and prayed never to see. Something on the order of well over 1,000, and by some accounts more than 2,000, Soviet warheads inbound. Bomber crews ran for their aircraft. Missile crews took their stations. The airborne command post, the plane designed to run a nuclear war from the sky, took off. And in the middle of the night, the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was woken by a telephone call telling him the United States was under massive nuclear attack, and he had minutes to advise the president to respond. The whole apocalypse was a piece of software. Someone had loaded a training tape, a simulation of exactly this scenario, an all-out Soviet strike, into a computer connected to the live warning system. The machine could not tell the difference between the exercise and the world. It took the drill and reported it as reality. What saved the 9th of November was not a genius and not a hunch. It was cross-checking, redundancy, the one thing that actually works. The rule in the American system was that a warning from the computers was not, on its own, enough. It had to be corroborated by the physical sensors, the early warning satellites in orbit and the ground radars, which should independently see the missiles climbing and their warheads arcing over the pole. And when the officers looked to those sensors for confirmation of the 2,000 incoming warheads, the sensors saw nothing. Empty sky. The satellites and the radars flatly contradicted the computer's story, because there were no missiles. That contradiction is what bought the minutes. Brzezinski, the accounts say, chose not to wake the president in the seconds he had, waiting for confirmation that never came, and the alert was called off before the point of no return. Note carefully what did the saving. Not one man's brilliance. A design that refused to trust a single source and demanded that reality vote before anyone acted. Cross-checking is the hero of the 9th of November. Remember that because we are, right now, in the business of building systems with less and less time for it. If the training tape were the only computer failure, you might call it a freak, a one-off human carelessness. It was not, because 7 months later the same system did it again, and this time nobody had loaded a tape. In June 1980, twice in the space of a few days, on the 3rd and again on the 6th, the American warning displays once more showed Soviet missiles inbound. Once more the machinery of response began to turn. Once more crews went to alert and Brzezinski was woken. And once more the cross-check held. The satellites and radars did not confirm, and the alarm was stood down. But this time the cause was almost insulting in its smallness. Engineers eventually traced the false attacks to a single faulty component, an integrated circuit, in the communications equipment. A chip. When it failed, it began inserting random numbers into the message that reported how many missiles had been detected, so that a message which should have read 0 was suddenly reading 2, or 200, or 2,000. The part that nearly started a nuclear war cost, by the standard telling, about 46 cents. And the failure was so intermittent they struggled even to reproduce it. Stop and let that number sit next to the other numbers, because this is the moment the instrument I promised you actually starts to read. 46 cents. 2 false alerts serious enough to launch bombers and wake the man who advises the president, caused by a component worth less than a cup of coffee. Set that beside the arsenals. Tens of thousands of warheads on each side. Trillions of dollars across the Cold War spent on the machinery of deterrence. And the thing that produces a false report of Armageddon is a defective chip in a rack, firing at random on a night like any other. This is the whole argument in a single image. The danger was never proportional to how much either side wanted a war. It was proportional to the reliability of the components and the noisiness of the signals, which means it was not rare, and it was not romantic. It was a rate, a false alarm rate, ticking away in the background of the entire nuclear age, set by the quality of hardware and the ambiguity of the sky, and largely indifferent to the intentions of any leader. That is the number this film exists to make you feel, and we are not finished adding to it. Which brings us back to where we began, to Petrov in the bunker on the 26th of September 1983. Now you can see his night for what it was. The Soviet satellite system, OKO, was watching the American missile fields from orbit, and it reported a launch. Then 5. The confidence was maxed out. The word on the panel said the highest certainty the system could express. By every rule Petrov had been trained on, this was the moment to lift the phone and start the count that ends the world. The cause was later understood to be a specific, almost poetic failure. The satellites had been placed in an orbit designed to look at the missile fields along the edge of the Earth, and at that particular time of year, at that particular hour, the sun was lining up behind the American bases, and its light was glinting off the tops of high-altitude clouds. Oko caught that glare and read it as the flames of missile engines. Sunlight on cloud, reported as the opening salvo of a nuclear war. It is the moon over Thule all over again, 23 years on, the same class of error dressed in newer technology. And here I have to take the hero away from you again, gently, because the myth is doing damage. You will have heard that Stanislav Petrov single-handedly saved the world, that one man's finger came off the button. That is not quite what happened, and the truth is more interesting. Petrov did not have the power to launch anything. His job was to report, to pass the warning up the chain to the people who would decide. What he refused to do was pass a warning he did not believe. And crucially, his disbelief was not a lone flash of intuition against the machine. It rested on exactly the thing we have already seen do the real work: corroboration. He knew the ground radars had not yet picked up the incoming missiles. He knew that a genuine first strike would be massive, not 5 lonely missiles. His human judgment was, in effect, running the cross-check the system had failed to run itself. So yes, honor him, but honor him for the right reason. Not as a lone genius who overruled the machine on a feeling, but as the last analog filter in a digital chain, a human being placed where he could demand that reality vote before the warning went up. The lesson of Petrov is not get lucky with heroes. It is keep a human being, with enough time and enough information to disbelieve the screen, in the loop. Those are very different lessons, and the machines we are building now respect only one of them. There is a final case, and it belongs to the other kind of false positive, the one that lives not in a sensor but in a mind, because it shows the mechanic working at the level of an entire government. In November 1983, the same autumn as Petrov, NATO ran a command exercise called Able Archer, part of a larger set of maneuvers. It was a war game, a rehearsal of the procedures NATO would use to escalate a conflict all the way up to nuclear release. It was, by design, only a simulation, but it was realistic, and it was happening at the worst possible moment. The Soviet leadership, under an ailing and fearful Andropov, had convinced itself that the West might be planning a genuine surprise first strike, and had launched a vast intelligence operation, codenamed Ryan, specifically to watch for the signs of one. So a Soviet intelligence machine primed to detect a Western first strike was now watching NATO rehearse, in convincing detail, the run-up to a Western first strike. According to the declassified accounts, some in the Soviet system read the exercise as possible cover for the real thing, and elements of Soviet forces were quietly brought to higher readiness. No sensor failed here. Every instrument worked. The false positive was in the interpretation, an ambiguous but genuine signal, a training exercise, read by a frightened mind as the opening of a war. Now, in fairness, Able Archer is the most disputed case in our count. Some historians argue the war scare has been overblown in the retelling, that the danger of those November days was real but smaller than the dramatic version suggests. And I want you to notice that even the dispute proves the point. The argument among historians is precisely about how close an ambiguous signal came to being read as an attack. The whole debate lives inside the mechanic. It is a fight over the reading, not over anyone's intent to start a war. So let us total the count honestly. The moon over Thule 1960, a sensor fooled. A submarine crew off Cuba 1962, a signal misread. A training tape 1979, a machine that could not tell a drill from a war. A 46-cent chip 1980, hardware firing at random. Sunlight on cloud over Petrov 1983, a sensor fooled again. Able Archer 1983, a whole system misreading a rehearsal. 6 cases, and in not one of them did a leader wake up and choose to attack. Every single one was a false positive, a machine or a mind reading a machine, reporting a war that was not happening. That is the instrument, read out loud, and it lets us answer the 2 historians who have been waiting in the wings, Because the honest thing to do with an argument is to hand it to the people most likely to knock it down. The first is Kenneth Waltz, perhaps the most influential optimist about the bomb who ever lived. Waltz argued across decades that nuclear weapons make the world more stable, not less. The costs of nuclear war are so obvious and so total, he said, that leaders are frozen into caution. Deterrence works precisely because no rational person will start a fight they cannot survive. And the strongest evidence he could point to is the one we cannot argue with. It is 1983, it is 2022, it is today, and the missiles have never flown. Not once. The system, Waltz would say, worked. You are alive to watch this film. What better proof could there be? It is a serious argument, and it deserves a serious answer, not a sneer. So here is the answer. Waltz is measuring the wrong thing. His theory is about intent, about whether leaders can be deterred from choosing war. And on that, he may well be right. Almost nobody in our count wanted a war. But look at what our 6 cases are actually made of. Not one of them was about intent at all. The moon, the tape, the chip, the sunlight, the depth charges, the exercise, none of these was a leader weighing the costs and choosing caution. Deterrence, the thing Waltz is so confident in, was never even engaged because at no point did anyone decide to attack. The danger came in through a completely different door. The false alarm, the misread signal, the failing part. It never cascaded, Waltz says, and he is right. But look at why it never cascaded. Not because deterrence held. Deterrence had nothing to grip. It never cascaded because each time the false positive ran into something that stopped it. A cross-check from a second sensor. A design that demanded corroboration. A man who knew that a real attack would not look like this. The unbroken piece Waltz points to is not proof that the system is safe. It is the sound of a filter holding, over and over, against a signal it was never guaranteed to catch. Which brings us to the second historian, and this is the one who genuinely threatens my argument, so I am going to give him full weight. His name is Benoît Pelopidas, and his target is people exactly like me. In an essay called The Unbearable Lightness of Luck, he warns that the stories we tell about near misses, the heroic tales of the man who said no, the officer who disbelieved the screen, are not just harmless drama. They are dangerous, because they teach us that the system contains its own salvation, that whenever the machine fails, some Arkhipov, some Petrov, will be there to catch it. That belief breeds complacency. And worse, Pelopidas argues, we call these escapes luck. And luck is precisely the thing you cannot measure, cannot bank, and cannot count on to be there next time. By dressing survival up as heroism, we let ourselves believe the danger is managed, when in truth we simply do not know how close we came, or how thin the margin really was. When I first read that, it felt like it demolished this entire film. I have just spent half an hour telling you about filters that held and men who disbelieved the screen. Am I not doing exactly the thing he warns against? Building a comforting story of heroes who will always be there. But look again, and Pelopidas does not sink the argument. He completes it. His warning is against celebrating the heroes, and that is exactly what I have refused to do. Every time a hero appeared in this film, I took him apart. Arkhipov, complicated by the archives. Petrov, not a lone genius but a crosscheck in human form. I have been at pains to strip the romance out, precisely because the romance is the dangerous part. Pelopidas says stop telling yourselves you were saved by heroes. I agree. So let us stop and do the thing he says we cannot. Let us measure. Because here is where I part company with him respectfully. He says luck cannot be measured, but the false alarm rate can be. We can count the cases. We have counted them tonight. We can see that the triggers were sensors and chips and misreadings, not decisions. We can see what actually stopped each one and notice that it was corroboration and human filtering, not deterrence and not intent. Pelopidas is right that we got lucky is not a safety strategy. But the way out of relying on luck is not despair. It is to name the real variable, the frequency and the catchability of false positives, and to build for that variable instead of praying for the next hero. His critique is not a wall in front of my argument. It is the foundation under it. So here is the verdict, stated as plainly as I can make it. The history of nuclear near misses is not a history of dangerous men being talked down from attack. It is a history of false alarms, machines and minds reporting a war that was not happening, again and again, driven by the noise of the world and the frailty of components, and largely disconnected from whether anybody actually wanted to fight. The risk was never really a function of how aggressive the leaders were. It was a function of how often the warning systems cried wolf and how much still stood between the cry and the launch. That is the instrument. That is what this film set out to read. And when you read it that way, the thing that saved us comes into focus, and it is not comforting. It was not the wisdom of statesmen. It was, over and over, redundancy and delay. A second censor that disagreed, a rule that demanded corroboration, and above all a human being placed in the loop, given just enough time and just enough information to look at a screen screaming that the world was ending and to say, "I do not believe you." Which leaves one last question, and it is not a historical one. It is about now. Every one of those saves depended on two things: a cross-check and time. Time for a second censor to disagree. Time for a man to think. And the entire direction of modern weapons is towards removing both. Missiles get faster. Hypersonic weapons compress the 30 minutes of the Cold War towards single figures. Warning systems get more automated, more entangled with artificial intelligence, promising to read the ambiguous sky faster than any human could. And every increment of speed, every promise to decide more quickly, does the same thing. It squeezes out the delay, and it eases out the human, the very filter that caught the moon and the tape and the chip and the sunlight. Petrov's whole contribution was that he had a few minutes and a mind allowed to doubt. We are, deliberately, engineering away the minutes and automating away the doubt. We are building systems designed to trust the screen and to act before a human can say, "I do not believe you." The last line of defense every time was a person, given just enough time to disbelieve the machine. And that is the person we are now, so proudly, so cleverly designing out of the loop. That should frighten you more than any arsenal, because the arsenals were never really the problem. The false alarms were, and we are about to face them with nobody left to pick up the phone.